Beer is a very popular drink in many parts of the world, and in the US it's even the most popular alcoholic beverage. Beer also enjoys an incredibly long history. Barley beer is likely to come from the Middle East, since evidence of beer production dates to Mesopotamia's ancient Sumerians. And archaeologists have even found ceramic vessels still containing beer residue from 3400 BC. Priestesses made an ancient brew, the recipe for which was preserved in the Himtanin Kasi from 1800 BC, the Sumerian goddess of beer. Throughout the following centuries, beer becomes the drink of choice in eras and places where drinking water is unsafe for consumption. Yet its continued popularity over such a long time span also leaves it ripe for a whole host of legends and folklore to emerge. Linked with saints, gods, and even witches, beer has many stories to tell. So let's go and explore some of those in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are sliding into another theme this month because obviously it's a new month, therefore it's a new theme. And this one I did a little bit differently because usually I know in advance exactly what it is that I want to do. And this time I was basically torn between 3 different topics and I will cover all of them. I just wanted to know what people wanted to hear the most first. So we had the folklore of different types of drinks, folklore associated with witches or different types of fairy, and I did run a poll on Twitter and then I also threw the questions open on my Facebook page as well, and the folklore of drinks won with 38% of the vote. In second place was types of fairy and then witches was last. All of them got 30% or over, but it basically worked out that drinks got the highest one, so that's why we're doing drinks first. But I will do different types of fairy and witches later on in the year as well. So I will do them, I just wanted to decide which one to do first. So we are starting off with the folklore of beer, which is really quite hilarious because I don't actually drink. So therefore, when I do any of the alcoholic ones, and I will be doing wine as well, then I am doing these from a position of someone who doesn't actually drink the product. Obviously, when we do tea and coffee, that's completely different because I love both of them. But yeah, the alcoholic ones are going to be quite interesting from that particular perspective. And I thought it might be quite helpful to give you a super short history of beer. And like I said in the introduction, obviously it does date all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. And I think it's really quite famous as well as being quite popular in ancient Egypt because they loved beer, but they also made it part of the everyday diet. And there is part of that is due to the fact that obviously water wasn't necessarily safe to drink, whereas obviously because of the different processes that go into making beer, it therefore kind of purifies the water. So the ancient Egyptians loved it. And interestingly, Osiris, who's usually portrayed as the god of the underworld, was also considered to be one of the patron deities of beer brewing and so on. And people believed that Osiris had taught them this, which partially explained why people would bury their dead with alcohol to then present to Osiris. Lots of the other Egyptian gods also had some kind of relationship to beer, even if it was somewhat tangential, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I think one of my favourites is the household god Bez, because he was actually the patron of beer brewers. Now, it then obviously went from ancient Egypt to the Greeks, and they drank beer well before it became common to then grow grapes for wine instead. But according to Cornelius Tacitus, the Romans weren't so impressed by beer, and they apparently described the favourite drink of the Teutons as, and I quote, a horrible brew fermented from barley or wheat, end quote. And Pliny then went on to write about how the Celts, the Gauls, the Germans, the Vandals and the Visigoths all made their own beer. When we then move forward a little bit in time, we then find that brewing was actually women's work until the medieval era, when monasteries started making their own beer. And women were gradually cut out of the process, largely because of the fact that the brewing process had then moved to monasteries, where they essentially had more time and the space to actually make this drink. And it was actually Charlemagne that eventually championed brewing as a science. But then it changes again when you then have the Black Death in 1348, and it's at this point that there's a whole range of factors across why the monasteries were no longer the sole producers of beer, that you then get a sense of commercial brewing. And part of this is because of the fact that survivors found themselves with more money and so on. And there's a lot of economic factors involved as well. And if you are interested in the history of beer and brewing, then I would recommend that you take a look at the Dictionary of Beer and Brewing by Dan Rubin and Carl Forget, because it does actually explain all of this in much more detail. But anyway, it's at this point when women then regain control of brewing and they then become known as alewives. And it's at this point that we then start to see the tavern appear, where it's essentially an inn with a tap room. So it can provide accommodation for travelling merchants, but then also supply them with beer and food and things like that as well. And interestingly, the oldest food law in the world actually refers to beer, and it dates to 1516 when Wilhelm IV, Duke of Bavaria, actually decreed that brewers could only use pure water, barley and hops in their beer. Obviously, over time, brewers finally perfected their art, giving us the drink that we would recognise today. Now, obviously, in terms of plants, beer is perhaps most associated with hops, and hops actually appear in an Old English proverb: "Till St. James's Day be come and gone, there may be hops and there may be none." Now, St. James's Day actually falls on the 25th of July, and in the UK, hops are normally ready to be harvested between August and September. So the proverb does seem to suggest that they may not be ready for harvest until after St. James's Day. Now, the English really had this weird thing where they thought that adding hops to beer was a way of contaminating it, so they didn't really want to do it. They only finally started to import cultivated hops from Flanders during the reign of Henry VIII. And hops, interestingly, fall under the rulership of Mars. Now, before hops were actually added to beer, brewers used a whole range of herbs to flavour their drinks, and some of them did actually include henbane, which could cause hallucinations, and sometimes the brewers were then persecuted when their brews went wrong, and it was really only the introduction of hops that stopped further executions of brew witches, and that again comes from that Dictionary of Beer and Brewing, so definitely worth looking into that a bit further. Now, the reason why I mention it, though, is there has been a persistent story that the stereotypical imagery associated with witches, which is the pointed hat, the cauldron and the cat, all come from female brewers. And there have been some claims that men accused these women of witchcraft following the turmoil of the Reformation purely so they could steal their business. Now, the problem is there isn't actually definitive evidence to link the costumes of the alewives with the witchcraft iconography that we recognise now. And the accusations of witchcraft have far deeper and more complicated explanations than a few male brewers trying to undercut the competition. Also, accusations of witchcraft predate the Reformation as well, so it is worth remembering that it's not always as simple as seeing a pithy little slide on Instagram and going, oh, that must be true. So in this case, it was quite interesting because The Conversation originally posted that article saying, this is the link between the two. And then they actually posted it again on the Smithsonian website and had to alter it because so many scholars actually said to them, look, that's too simplistic, there's all these other factors as well. So as always, critical thinking is our friend. But in terms of plants though, because obviously that is what I wanted to talk about here, herbalists were really big fans of a plant called borage. And this was actually noted as being one of the cordial flowers most likely to boost the spirits, and that's along with rose, violet and alkanet. And adding borage to wine could drive away melancholy and sadness, but if you added borage to beer, it would help revive the drinker's passion. And it also then starts to appear in medicinal remedies, and I think we can probably take the medicinal bit probably with a bit of a pinch of salt, because various sources, including the discovery of witchcraft, actually recommended a mixture of gin, beer and acorns as a cure for ague, and alternatively you could mix beer with mustard for the same illness. Now, we do have to bear in mind that ague is usually defined as being a fever, such as malaria, and this usually has chills, fever and sweating reoccurring at regular intervals. So I can see why mustard might help, but I'm not 100% sure why beer would, unless it was just simply the delivery mechanism as a liquid. And also, and I love this one, you could use beer to cure warts. And what you needed to do is scrape the froth from new beer and then take yourself off somewhere private in the morning, because you had to do this when nobody could see you. And you would then just simply apply the froth to any of the warts and then leave it there. You don't wipe it off, you just leave it to do its thing. But then if you do that for 3 mornings in a row, your warts were supposed to disappear. Now, compared to some of the cures for warts, that one actually seemed like reasonably doable. So I did think that was quite cool. But speaking of plants, this is where we do then start to see some of the links between beer and witchcraft. And in Poland, herbs occasionally turn up in early modern witch trial documentation. And as a result, Michael Ostling, in his article for Folklore, actually counsels us not to confuse witchcraft with herbcraft, because as he explains, and I quote, "A very small proportion of accused witches across Europe seem to have been herbal healers in any sense, and an even smaller proportion came to trial as a direct result of their healing practices," end quote, which pretty much goes against this idea that's really prevalent that the people who were being accused of witchcraft were just simple healers and, were completely innocent of everything. Again, there is always so much more to this than meets the eye, and I really would highly recommend Ronald Hutton's The Witch if you're interested in things like witch trials and stuff like that. But that said, some herbs do appear in these Polish trial records, and for our purposes they do relate to beer. And some of the herbs that Michael Ostling describes demonstrate the belief that witches' herbs might be used in a benevolent way, such as for healing or to protect against witchcraft. But they might also be used in love magic, which is considered unorthodox if not downright malevolent, or even used for demonic possession, simply by being sneaked into someone's beer. And there were even rituals recorded in the trials to remove enchantments on beer, which might involve signings of the cross, invoking the Virgin Mary, or using gold, myrrh and frankincense that had been blessed at 3 masses. Now that said, Michael Ostling also notes a remedy to lift bewitchment that involves boiling southernwood, which is in the Artemisia family, with another herb that was most likely milkwort, and then bathing the victim before mixing the concoction with beer and getting them to drink it, and apparently this would lift bewitchment. And also, a trial in 1549 saw a male fern thrown under a vat of bewitched beer, which apparently made the vat burst and then reveal human bones within it as being the source of the enchantment, which is quite interesting. Now, obviously, this is all kind of looking at beer as being a very positive thing, and quite interestingly, that's sort of how it appears in a lot of the superstitions as well. So there was one superstition that said that if you drank beer in a shop, it meant that you'd enjoy prosperity in the future. There was another one saying that a beer falling next to a person was a good luck omen, and so was spilled beer running towards a person. And also, if you wanted to bring yourself good luck, you should put a beer bottle on a piano or organ. You could also use a variation of superstitions while making beer as well, in order to make sure it was the best beer possible. So if when you were making it, you put a coal into the beer before you added the yeast, it would mean that the beer wouldn't go sour. And you were also not to think of someone who'd been cross while making small beer, otherwise it would end up really mild. And Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud also note an old belief that thunder could spoil stored liquor, so you had to lay an iron bar across the top of a barrel to protect the beer inside from going sour. And finally, if you upset beer, it meant that you'd have a christening in the house before long. If you're interested in the appearance of beer in Welsh legends and folklore specifically, then Mark Rees has an entire podcast episode about it, which I will link in the show notes below. And meanwhile, Mark Norman does have a chapter about the folklore of beer and brewing in his book, Telling the Bees and Other Customs, the Folklore of Rural Crafts, which I will also link below. And he goes into some of the other cultural beliefs from places outside of Europe. Now, we do have to bear in mind that these are all quite general associations with beer, but there are then associations with specific figures throughout folklore and mythology. And according to Mickey Bumbar, Aegir was the brewer of the Asgardian gods, and he was considered the personification of the sea. Now, in some of the sources, he's described as being a giant rather than a god, and he was apparently the only giant that had any kind of good relationship with both the Aesir and the Vanir among these gods of Asgard. Now, the gods weren't actually allowed to fight in his hall beneath the sea, or they'd be banished forever, although this does seem to relate more to an incident starring Loki than anything more general. And his beer is supposedly the best of all the 9 realms. Now, given he also offered beer in self-refilling drinking horns, you can see why the gods wouldn't want to be banished. He was said to brew his beer in a kettle that was a mile wide and deep, and apparently Thor stole this kettle from the giant Hymir and gave it to Aegir so he could do his brewing. And it did also mean that anyone who died at sea was dining in Aegir's hall because it was believed to be beneath the waves. Now, also there's a fascinating legend from southeast Devon concerning St Dunstan and beer. And St Dunstan we've covered before as like the patron saint of blacksmiths. But in this particular story, he'd bought lots of barley because he wanted to make beer. And the devil turned up and offered to blight the apple trees if St Dunstan sold himself to the devil. Naturally, with no apple trees, there could be no cider, thus creating more of a demand for beer. Now, surprisingly, St Dunstan somehow agreed, but he negotiated a deal with the devil. I'm presuming this then meant he wasn't selling himself to him. But he requested that the blight should happen in 3 days' time, which meant it fell across the 17th to the 19th of May, with the 19th of May being St Dunstan's Day. Now, apple trees were usually in blossom at the time, so if there was a sharp frost between these 3 days, they knew who to blame. Now, it is obviously likely to be a tale invented to explain late frosts that damaged trees in May, but it is quite interesting setting up this opposition between beer and cider. But of course, there is one figure perhaps more associated with beer than St Dunstan, and that's Gambrinus, and he's usually linked with both beer and brewing, and is often depicted with a mug or tankard of beer. Now, he's been linked with a whole range of real historical figures, including Gambrinus, John I, Duke of Brabant, and John the Fearless. Now, the most common tale about him appears to come from a short story by Charles Dulin, published in 1868, in which he's actually called Gambrinus. And this particular story sees Gambrinus as a poor young glassblower's apprentice. He loves Flandrine, his boss's daughter, but she isn't interested in him until he can gain power and status. So he leaves town, heartbroken, and starts playing his violin all over Holland and Belgium, and he then becomes famous for his somewhat prodigious talent, and eventually the people of his hometown beg him to play a concert. He does so, but his ability completely deserts him when he sees Flandrine in the crowd. The crowd, furious at the turn that his concert takes, then riot, and Gambrinus is held responsible and thrown in prison. The devil comes to him and offers to free him in exchange for his soul, and in one version of the story he does this by just killing the judge, which is one way of solving the problem, I suppose. But the devil gives Gambrinus tremendous luck in gambling, and then Gambrinus ends up filthy rich. The devil also introduces him to the plant hops and teaches him how to make beer. And finally, he gives him a carillon that will play music that no one can resist dancing to. So Gambrinus goes back to his hometown and tries to sell his beer in the market square. Problem is, no one wants it. So he starts playing the carillon, and soon everyone is compelled to dance. Once they've been worked up into a terrific thirst, they finally relent and decide to try his beer. Unsurprisingly, they love it, and Gambrinus becomes a hit, and he ends up becoming the Duke of Brabant, although most people call him the King of Beer. Now, Flandrine decides that she's finally ready to accept him now that he has a title and money, so she goes off to visit him. He doesn't recognise her though, because he's finally forgotten her. Now, Gambrinus lives for another 30 years, as the devil promised, but then it becomes time to collect, and Gambrinus gets the devil's messenger drunk on beer and escapes to live for another 100 years. And then when the devil learns that Gambrinus has actually just died naturally, he turns up to collect his soul in person, except Gambrinus' body has turned into a beer barrel, and the devil finally has to accept that he is not going to get Gambrinus' soul. And I think that's quite an interesting story on many levels, but it does fall into that nice little tradition of stories where people manage to outwit the devil. So what do we make of the folklore of beer? Well, many of the superstitions and remedies associated with beer focus on its positive effect on the mood or good luck, and it's very much linked with joviality and high spirits. And I do think it's quite interesting that it basically then helps a mortal man evade the devil and creates a new income stream for St Dunstan. And we don't actually even really need the links between beer and witches, because while evidence may yet emerge to definitively link alewives with witchcraft, we're probably better off focusing on the facts for the time being. And I personally think just the idea of women dominating the industry of brewing at one point in the past is really interesting and probably requires further investigation. But then obviously with its use in folk remedies, I do think that beer is interesting enough on its own just for further study without adding all of these other elements as well. So I'd love to know what you make of that. If you've got a favourite beer, please do feel free to let me know. Like I say, I don't drink, so I'm probably not going to know what the difference between them is. But I'm always fascinated by all these craft ales with really fantastic names and the brilliant sort of pump clips and things like that. So there's a lot about beer that I find interesting. I just think it's absolutely disgusting as a beverage, but there we go. So please do feel free to let me know. Let me know if there's any other beer superstitions that you've heard. If you make your own homebrew, please feel free to drop me a message and let me know how you got started and things like that, because I genuinely am interested in things like that. We are going to have a look at the folklore of tea next week, because I thought it might be quite nice to have a look at sort of superstitions and things related to that, because obviously it's a non-alcoholic beverage, so I thought I'd probably try and alternate them a little bit throughout April. And we are also going to have one of the special interview-based episodes this month as well, so I'm quite excited about that one, but I'll announce more about that nearer the time. And finally, just in case that isn't enough, I am doing a talk at the Newcastle Castle on 15th of April about the folklore of Easter. So things like how did sort of rabbits and hot cross buns and eggs and so on become associated with Easter in the first place. And you can obviously book tickets to come and actually see me live in person. And if you can't make it, then I am actually doing that talk in conjunction with Cresswell Crags the following Monday. So if obviously you're not in Newcastle, then please feel free to come along and watch it online instead. And I'll put the 2 booking links in the show notes if you're interested. And it would be really lovely to see some of you there. But without any further ado, that is the end of this week's episode, because as I suspected, it has ended up being a little bit longer because there was just so much to say. I will let you crack on with whatever it was you're doing before you started listening. I hope that you have a marvellous day and indeed an excellent week ahead, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio! Well, thank you for listening and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.